was the summer of 2006, and Mandy and her best friend were ready to embrace adulthood with a cruise full of adventure. The ship was a floating paradise, promising endless food, music, and carefree fun. As the vessel cut through the tranquil waters, the ocean stretched endlessly under the glow of a full moon. For Mandy, it felt like a perfect escape, far from the noise of the world. But as the vast sea surrounded them, a chilling truth remained unseen. Isolation breeds vulnerability, and beneath the surface of paradise, shadows often wait to reveal themselves in the darkest of hours. That night, Mandy couldn't sleep. The cabin was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the ship's engines. Her friend was soundly asleep, but Mandy's mind refused to rest. She tossed and turned, frustration mounting with every passing minute. Finally, she gave up. Grabbing her headphones, cigarettes, and lighter, she decided a walk on the deck might calm her. As she stepped into the hallway, the stillness felt unnatural, almost oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around her, the faint glow of the sconces casting long, flickering shadows. Something about the silence gnawed at her. But she pressed on. Mandy stepped into the hallway, her headphones dangling loosely in her hand. The corridor stretched long and silent before her, illuminated only by dim, flickering sconces along the walls. Each light cast trembling shadows, creating shapes that seemed to shift and breathe as she walked. The doors to the passenger cabins were all closed, their brass knobs gleaming faintly. Not a sound came from behind them. No murmurs, no snoring, nothing. Her footsteps echoed against the plush carpet, muffled yet still loud enough to break the stillness. The further she walked, the more unnatural the silence felt. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of night, but an eerie absence, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. Mandy adjusted her grip on her lighter, her pace quickening without her realizing it. She glanced over her shoulder, an involuntary chill running down her spine. The hallway was empty, just as she expected, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Her pulse quickened, and she turned back around, muttering under her breath, "Get a grip, Mandy. It's just your imagination." As she ascended the stairwell to the upper deck, the sense of unease only grew. The staircase creaked slightly under her weight, each step reverberating like a distant drumbeat. She paused for a moment, gripping the railing tightly, and looked back again. The corridor below stretched into darkness, utterly lifeless. The air grew cooler as she approached the deck, and the faint sound of waves crashing against the ship's hull reached her ears. She exhaled, trying to steady herself. The rational part of her mind insisted she was fine. Everyone was asleep, and the ship was secure. Still, a nagging whisper at the back of her mind told her she wasn't alone. When she finally pushed open the door to the upper deck, the night air hit her like a wave, cool and salty. The scene was starkly different from the oppressive hallway. The open sky stretched above her, littered with stars, and the ocean shimmered under the moonlight. For a moment, the unease began to fade. She took a deep breath and stepped further onto the deck, the heavy door closing softly behind her. But the silence persisted, and the weight of the shadows seemed to follow her. Somewhere deep inside, Mandy felt it. This night was far from ordinary. Mandy found a bench at the bow of the ship, far from the light of the deck and the sounds of the bustling nightlife below. She settled down, feeling the cool metal of the bench beneath her. The ocean stretched out endlessly before her, a vast expanse of black water that seemed to swallow the moonlight whole. Only the faint glow of the stars and the soft reflection of the moon on the water offered any light, casting an ethereal sheen across the waves. She lit a cigarette, the soft click of the lighter breaking the stillness. The smoke curled up into the night air, mingling with the crisp sea breeze. Mandy took a long drag, feeling the nicotine fill her lungs and soothe her anxious mind. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to forget the nagging unease that had followed her through the ship's empty corridors. The calmness of the ocean, the gentle rocking of the ship, and the rhythmic sound of the waves were all so peaceful. This was supposed to be a time for relaxation, a time to unwind and enjoy the freedom of being away from home. Yet, the discomfort lingered at the edges of her thoughts. The soft creaking of the ship beneath her, the faint whoosh of the wind, and the distant sounds of the water were the only things she could hear. Her favorite band played softly in her ears as she gazed at the reflection of the moon on the water. The waves seemed to shift in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, almost like a living entity, and for a brief moment, Mandy wondered if the ocean had its own secrets too. Just as she was beginning to lose herself in the solitude, she felt a shift beside her. A presence, unwelcome and sudden, disturbed the quiet. She turned sharply, her heart jumping in her chest. A man, somewhere in his 40s, had quietly sat down next to her. His movements were so fluid, so deliberate, that Mandy hadn't noticed him approach. He was too close. Too close for comfort. The man smiled at her, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mandy instinctively recoiled, but her body remained frozen, unsure whether to stay or leave. The eerie quiet of the ship made his presence even more unsettling. She quickly looked back at the water, her breath shallow, as the feeling of being watched crept over her once more. The night that had felt peaceful moments ago now felt heavy, suffocating, and she couldn't shake the sense that something dark was lurking just beneath the surface of the calm. Mandy tried to focus on the ocean, pretending the man beside her didn't exist. She hoped her indifference would make him lose interest, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He was too close, his body angled toward her. Even though she wasn't looking at him, she could feel his eyes on her, scanning her like a predator sizing up its prey. Her heart thudded in her chest as she turned her head slightly, enough to catch him in her peripheral vision. He was staring. When their eyes met, he smiled, a thin, crooked grin that only deepened her unease. Without a word, he reached over and yanked one of her earbuds out of her ear. Startled, Mandy jerked back, her hand flying up instinctively. "What the hell?" she said, her voice sharper than she intended. The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "You're pretty," he said simply, as if that explained everything. Mandy forced a tight smile, hoping to keep things from escalating. Thanks," she muttered, quickly putting her earbud back in. She turned away, staring resolutely at the water, but the man wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his breath too warm against the cool night air. "Are you here alone?" he asked. His tone was casual, but the question sent a chill down her spine. Her instincts screamed at her to lie. "No," she replied quickly, her voice unsteady. "I'm with my boyfriend. He's sleeping." The man's grin stretched wider, his teeth glinting faintly in the moonlight. "If you were my girlfriend," he said, his voice low and oily, "I'd be making these waves rock." He chuckled at his own crude joke, but Mandy's stomach churned. She glanced around the empty deck, her pulse racing. There was no one else in sight, no one to call for help. Her cigarette burned down to the filter, forgotten between her fingers. The man leaned even closer, and Mandy could feel the weight of his presence pressing against her. "My name's John," he said, his voice soft but unsettling. "What's yours?" Mandy didn't answer. She shoved her earbud back in, hoping he'd take the hint. But he didn't. He reached out again, yanking the earbud free a second time. Her patience snapped. She stood up abruptly, glaring down at him. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking but firm. His smile never wavered. "I have wine in my room," he said smoothly. "You should join me for a glass." The words sent a jolt of terror through her. Mandy took a step back, her voice rising. "No, I don't drink wine and I don't know you. Leave me alone." The man chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming. "So angry," he said almost teasingly. "You need someone to clear that up for you." Mandy's hands clenched into fists as she turned and began walking away. Her only thought was to get as far from him as possible, but she'd only taken a few steps when she felt his hand close around her wrist. Mandy froze as the man's hand clamped around her wrist. It was rough, his grip firm and unrelenting. Her breath caught in her throat, and panic surged through her body. She tried to pull away, but his strength kept her rooted in place. The lighthearted smirk he'd worn before was gone, replaced by something darker, more menacing. "Don't be so quick to leave," he said, his voice low and almost playful, but laced with something far more sinister. He yanked her closer, his other arm wrapping around her in a sudden, suffocating embrace. Mandy felt her heart hammering in her chest as her personal space vanished completely. Her senses were overwhelmed. The stench of his sweat mixed with the faint smell of alcohol on his breath. Then she felt it, an unmistakable bulge pressing against her leg. A wave of revulsion and fear swept over her, freezing her mind for a moment before instinct kicked in. "You smell so good," he murmured, his voice dripping with unsettling satisfaction. Mandy's body stiffened in terror. "No!" she screamed, her voice breaking through the heavy silence of the night. She thrashed violently in his grasp, twisting and kicking with everything she had. Her scream echoed across the empty deck, slicing through the eerie quiet. The man flinched, momentarily startled by her sudden burst of energy. Taking advantage of his hesitation, Mandy wrenched her wrist free and shoved herself away from him. She stumbled backward, her lungs gasping for air as she put distance between them. "Stay away from me," she yelled, her voice trembling but defiant. Her eyes darted toward the entrance back into the ship, the door now seeming impossibly far away. The man took a step forward, his grin returning, as if her resistance only amused him. "Feisty," he said, his voice mocking. But Mandy didn't give him a chance to act. She spun on her heel and bolted for the door, her legs moving faster than they ever had before. Her pulse roared in her ears as she ran, her shoes slapping against the deck with each desperate step. Behind her, she thought she could hear faint footsteps, but she didn't dare look back. The ship's lights seemed to flicker like warning signs, urging her forward. As she reached the door, it flew open. A uniformed security guard stood there, his eyes wide with concern. Mandy nearly collapsed into him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed me," she choked out, tears spilling down her cheeks. The guard's face hardened and he stepped out onto the deck, his hand resting on his radio. But when she turned to look, the deck was empty. The man was gone, swallowed by the shadows and the sea. The security guard's sharp gaze scanned the empty deck, his body tense and ready for action. Mandy clung to the doorway, her knees weak and trembling, unable to comprehend how the man had disappeared so quickly. The space that had felt so suffocating just moments ago now seemed vast and eerily silent. "Are you sure he was out here?" the guard asked, his voice steady but laced with doubt. Mandy nodded frantically, her words tumbling out between ragged breaths. "He was here. He grabbed me. I screamed. He said his name was John. Please, you have to find him." The guard's brow furrowed as he stepped further onto the deck, shining his flashlight into every shadowed corner. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only empty benches and the endless expanse of the ocean. "There's no one here now," he said after a moment, his tone calm but cautious. "But I saw him," Mandy insisted, her voice rising. "He was right here. He wouldn't just vanish." The guard returned to her side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Let's get you inside," he said gently. "You're safe now. We'll handle it." Still trembling, Mandy allowed herself to be led back into the ship. The warmth of the interior lights felt jarring after the cold, ominous air of the deck. The guard escorted her to a small office where he handed her a clipboard and a pen. "I need you to fill out a report," he explained. "Give me as much detail as you can about the man. What he looked like, what he said, anything you remember." Her hands shook as she began writing, recounting every terrifying detail. The man's mocking grin, his invasive touch, the way he had appeared so suddenly and then vanished just as quickly. The guard watched her closely, nodding as she spoke. When she finished, he leaned forward, his expression serious. "We'll check the ship's records and the surveillance cameras," he assured her. "If this man is on board, we'll find him." But the next morning, Mandy learned the unsettling truth. There was no record of anyone named John on the ship. No one matching his description had been seen by the crew or passengers. It was as if he had never existed at all. Her friend, alarmed by the story, made Mandy promise never to go out on the deck alone again. The rest of the cruise passed uneventfully, but Mandy couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even years later, the memory haunted her, the strange man who had appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as mysteriously. What scared her most wasn't that he had been real. It was the possibility that he hadn't been. The final days of the cruise passed in an uneasy blur. Mandy tried her best to focus on the lively distractions, the laughter of other passengers, the endless buffet spreads, the sunlit decks. But the fear lingered. Every creak of the ship, every shadow in her peripheral vision felt like a warning. She stuck close to her friend, avoiding any moment of isolation, and never ventured back to the deck alone. The memory of that night clung to her like a second skin. She couldn't stop replaying it in her mind. The man's cold touch, his unsettling grin, and the way he had disappeared into thin air. The ship's crew had assured her they were investigating, but each time she asked for an update, their answers grew more vague. "We're looking into it," they said, or "There's no sign of him." Even the cameras had failed her. When she pressed for details about the surveillance footage, she was met with confused expressions. "There's no footage of anyone matching that description on the deck," one crew member admitted hesitantly. "We've checked every angle, every timestamp. Are you sure it wasn't a misunderstanding?" The words echoed in her mind, fueling her frustration. How could they dismiss something so vivid, so real? Mandy could still feel the man's breath against her skin, still hear his voice whispering in her ear. It wasn't her imagination. It couldn't be. But as the cruise neared its end, Mandy began to wonder. The ship's corridors no longer felt menacing. The decks during the day seemed harmless, and the ocean, though vast and eerie at night, seemed indifferent. Had her exhaustion that night played tricks on her? Had the isolation of the early hours conjured a nightmare that felt real? The night before disembarkation, she found herself staring out her cabin window at the endless sea. The moon hung low, casting long streaks of silver across the waves. She thought she saw something out there, a shadow shifting on the water, a ripple that didn't belong. Her breath hitched, but when she blinked, it was gone. When the cruise finally docked, Mandy stepped onto solid ground with a deep sense of relief. But as she walked away from the ship, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something behind, or that something was leaving with her. Years later, she would still wake in the dead of night, her skin clammy, her heart pounding. The memory was as vivid as ever, the man who shouldn't have been there, the man who couldn't have been real. Or could he? Years passed, but Mandy could never fully escape the events of that night. The memory lingered in the quiet moments, slipping into her thoughts when she least expected it. She tried to rationalize it as a strange but explainable encounter, a desperate man, a lapse in ship security, or even a hallucination born of exhaustion and the eerie stillness of the ocean. But deep down, she knew better. Late at night, when sleep refused to come, she would lie awake and think of the unanswered questions. Who was he? How did he vanish without a trace? Why had no one seen him? And how had he evaded the ship's cameras? The lack of resolution only deepened her unease, turning the incident into a puzzle with no solution. Sometimes she thought she saw him in the shadows of crowded places, a fleeting figure that matched his height and build, a face with a twisted grin that sent her heart racing. These moments left her shaken, questioning her own sanity. The worst were the dreams. They came rarely, but when they did, they were vivid and suffocating. In them, she was back on the deck, the ocean stretching endlessly around her. The man would emerge from the shadows, his smile as cold and predatory as she remembered. No matter how fast she ran, he was always there, his voice echoing in her ears. "You're so pretty." Even in waking life, the feeling of being watched sometimes returned. Alone at night, in quiet places, Mandy would feel the hair on her neck stand on end, as though unseen eyes lingered just out of sight. She would tell herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks. But deep down, she feared the truth. Whatever he wasn't finished with her. It wasn't until years later, on an otherwise ordinary evening, that Mandy's lingering fear turned into something more. She was walking home from work, the city streets quieter than usual, bathed in the cold glow of flickering streetlights. The familiar rhythm of her heels against the pavement offered a small comfort, but the silence pressed in, amplifying every small sound. She tried to shake off the unease that had crept over her. It was just her imagination again, she told herself, the remnants of a memory she should have buried long ago. Yet she couldn't ignore the prickling sensation crawling up her spine, the same feeling she'd had that night on the deck. As she rounded a corner, she noticed a figure standing beneath a streetlight ahead. At first, it seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. just another pedestrian waiting or lost in thought. But as she drew closer, her steps faltered. The figure stood unnaturally still, their face obscured in shadow. Her heart quickened as she recognized the outline of his frame. Tall, broad-shouldered, the way he stood slightly hunched forward. It was him. The same man from the ship. The same predatory stance as if he'd been waiting just for her. Mandy's breath hitched and her mind raced. This wasn't possible. He couldn't be here. He wasn't real, or wasn't supposed to be. Frozen in place, she watched as the figure slowly turned its head toward her. The streetlight flickered, casting momentary darkness. When it lit again, the man was gone. Mandy broke into a run, her pulse hammering in her ears. She didn't stop until she was home, locking the door behind her. Her hands shook as she pressed her back against the door, realizing one horrifying truth. Whatever he was, he had found her again.